everybody. Like I said, we were going to do a little our tackles talk at the end of the show. And, you know, we try to plan things out. But remember, Mother Nature plays her role. She tells us what we can and can't do. And in this case today, we wanted to get back in real shallow with the beaver tail, which it gets into 7 inches. But we had like a real negative tide this morning with a real strong wind from the northeast. So barely to tell you some of the places that I wanted to get into that I would have been able to get in with the beaver tail, I just couldn't. It was dry land. So we had to do number 2 since we're already on the water. We went out to and found an area that is barely no water at all, but it feeds into this man-made canal. And we knew that the trout would get in there. But again, like everything else, it took a while to get the trout going. And when that happens, we have different techniques that we use. But first, let me tell you what I was using and then how we did our technique. Now, number 1 is I use Finn's Wind Tamer line because I like the fins. It works very well. It's thin. You can cast real light jig heads, anything you want with it, even in windy days, and doesn't take a lot of weight for it to go down. Number 2 is sometimes, normally we use 30-pound test fluorocarbon. Sometimes that's in the summer. As the water gets cleaner, I switch over to 20. And then sometimes even down to 15-pound test. Now, in this case, believe it or not, 25 was working perfect. It gave me that little edge in case we happen to get a big redfish or something. So I was using 25-pound leader. Here's another misconception too, and some of y'all might argue with me. Fluorocarbon is great, but there's also an alternative out there. There's some what they call premium monofilament line that can be used for leader. I've been doing this for years, especially on the 25-pound test on the premium monofilament line. I found it to be just as good as any 20 or 30-pound fluorocarbon, and I can tell you, it's 1/10 of the price. But you got to buy a quality one. You don't buy a cheap brand. You buy a good brand, a big spool. It'll last you 2 or 3 years. Just keep it out of the sun, and you'll be way ahead of the game. The other thing that we do, we use either a 1/0 or a 2/0 circle hook, and we put a split shot just above the hook, because this time of the year, the trout, here again, we're fishing this 8-10 foot deep man-made cut. They're sitting on the bottom, and you have to get that shrimp or that artificial bait on the bottom, and I don't just let it sit there. I let it sits, 2 cranks, tip it up just a little bit, let it sit again, count to about 5, 2 cranks, tip it up, because these trout are sitting on the bottom, they're lethargic. We had 64-degree weather. It's not all that cold, but they're in there already. And that's the only way you get them to bite. Now, there's an alternative to that, too, that I started using a long time ago. We used to use a lot of 1/8 ounce jig heads. They work perfect. 1/8 ounce jig heads, they just work perfect. But also, they're expensive. So getting on the internet, something that came from the Keys, and I remember using these years ago, is what they call a yellowtail jig. And it's nothing but a hook with the lid around the shank of the hook. And they come in different sizes and different colors. Does the colors matter? I don't think so. I've used the regular, the white, the red, the chartreuse. They all seem to work. In this case, when I'm fishing for like redfish this time of the year, and I want to work that shrimp real slow on the bottom, I use the 1/0 right there. Little 1/0 hook on a 1/8 ounce jig head, that yellowtail jig, and that works terrific. Then I step it up. If I'm going for the trout have a bigger mouth, remember that. So you got to have a bigger hook. So we go to the 1/8 ounce and sometimes a 1/4 ounce 2/0 yellowtail jig head, and that seems to work perfect. And even if the trout are getting pretty big, we go to a wide gap yellowtail jighead. And let me tell you a good thing about the wide gap. You're talking about catching some big fish on the bottom. That wide gap lets you put a chunk of ladyfish or a big chunk of pinfish on it and let it sit on the bottom, and just while you're catching your other fish, let that one or two rods sit somewhere the other side of the boat and watch what happens. So again, you know, some of the things you need. I'm what they call the bottle guy in my neighborhood, but the way I keep everything from getting rusty on my boat is my neighbors all save me. They're nice little bottles. I take the time to take the label off. I mount them. I leave the little salt stuff in it that gets rid of the moisture bag in it. And I can put 50, 60 one-aught hooks in one of these bottles, even more. I can put 50 long shank hooks on some of these, quite a bit. And the thing is, they're always going to be dry. So take this, remember, fish on the bottom, fish slow, and catch the fish.